Thunder 2-1, this is Overlord. You are crossing into a politically denied zone. Turn back immediately. I repeat, RTB immediately. The voice in Captain Elena Valkyrie Vance's earpiece wasn't just loud. It was laced with the terrified authority of a man watching a career end on a radar screen. Overlord, Thunder 2-1, I have broken squelch. I am unable to copy. Elena lied, her voice flat, devoid of the tremors shaking her hands on the stick. Below her, the jagged peaks of the Carrack Valley rose like teeth waiting to snap. Vance! Do not do this! The colonel's voice broke through, abandoning protocol. If you drop ordnance across that border, there is no coming back. You will be court-martialed before your wheels touch the tarmac. Do you hear me? That is a direct order. Elena looked at her fuel gauge. 200 pounds. Barely enough to loiter, let alone fight and return. Then she looked at the targeting pod feed. Thermal blooms, hundreds of them. Swarming a tiny, desperate cluster of cold signatures huddled in a dried riverbed. Major, her wingman, a young lieutenant with a shaky voice, whispered over the interflight frequency. My RWR is lighting up. They have SAMs. If we go down there, then we go down fighting, Lieutenant. Elena flipped the master arm switch to on. The familiar clunk felt like a gavel striking a judge's block. Overlord, this is Thunder 2-1, commencing runs. God help us all. She reached up and severed the SATCOM link. The cockpit fell into a terrifying electric silence, broken only by the hum of the GAU-8 Avenger beneath her feet. 36 hours earlier, forward operating base, Dust Bowl, undisclosed location. The air at forward operating base, Dust Bowl, didn't just shimmer. It vibrated with a malice that felt personal. It was 1300 Zulu, the sun hanging like a bleached skull over the jagged horizon of the borderlands. Captain Elena Valkyrie Vance wiped a slurry of grit and sweat from her forehead, her flight suit sticking to her skin like a second, heavier layer of dermis. She stood on the wing root of her A-10C Thunderbolt II, the metal radiating enough heat to sear flesh through a glove. Check the hydraulic lines on the port stabilizer again, Chief, Elena said, her voice raspy. She didn't shout. She never shouted. Her tone was the low, flat grind of a tectonic plate shifting, warning of an earthquake if ignored. Senior Airman Miller, a kid who looked like he hadn't slept in 3 days, looked up from the access panel. Captain, we checked it twice. The fluid levels are green. Maintenance control wants this bird buttoned up. We're in a level 1 diplomatic freeze. You're not flying anywhere. I verify my own aircraft, Miller. Check it again. Elena didn't look at him. She was staring at the GAU-8 Avenger cannon protruding from the nose of the jet, like the snout of a prehistoric beast. The 7 barrels were dull gray, capped and cold. A silent gun was a useless gun. She climbed down the ladder, her boots hitting the concrete with a heavy thud. The base was eerily quiet. Usually, at this hour, the air would be tearing apart with the sound of F-16s on afterburner or the heavy whump-whump of Chinooks ferrying supplies. Today, nothing. Just the wind hissing through the razor wire. The silence was political. The treaty signed in Geneva 48 hours ago had turned the airspace north of the Carrack Valley into a de-escalation zone. To the politicians, it was a triumph of diplomacy. To Elena, it was a tactical blindfold. ROE card, she muttered to herself, pulling the laminated sheet from her leg pocket. Rule 1, do not cross latitude 34 north. Rule 2, no kinetic strikes without visual confirmation of hostile act directed at U.S. forces. Rule 3, return to base immediately if painted by foreign radar. It wasn't a rules of engagement card. It was a suicide note for anyone on the ground. Elena walked toward the hangars, her eyes scanning the logistical movements. That's when she saw it. A convoy of loaders moving away from the flight line. They were carrying pallets of 30mm ammunition back to the bunkers. They were destocking. A cold knot formed in her stomach. You don't destock a forward base unless you expect a long peace or a total withdrawal. Neither made sense. The intel reports she'd skimmed that morning spoke of increased chatter in the valley. Code words for mass movement. She pushed through the heavy blast doors of the Tactical Operations Center, TOC. The sudden transition from blinding light to the dim, blue-lit room momentarily disorienting her. The air conditioning smelled of stale coffee and ozone. "Captain Vance?" Colonel Holloway didn't look up from his desk. He was a man who managed wars from spreadsheets, more concerned with fuel budgets than fire support. "You're not on the roster. Why are you in my TOC?" "Logistics is pulling ammo, sir," Elena said, standing at parade rest but leaning forward slightly. "And the satellite feeds for Sector 4 are delayed by 20 minutes. Why?" Holloway sighed, taking off his glasses. "Because Sector 4 is now a partnered sovereignty zone. We are minimizing our footprint to show good faith. The ammo is being rotated. Standard procedure." "There are 400 operators from Task Force Wolfpack inserting into Sector 4 tonight, Colonel," Elena said, her voice dropping an octave. "If they get hit, and we are destocked." "They won't get hit," Holloway snapped. "It's a summit raid, in and out. Quiet professionals doing quiet work. They don't need a warthog screaming over their heads, waking up the whole province." Elena looked at the large main screen. The blue icons representing the SEAL teams were stationary, clustered near a ravine known locally as the Grinder. The terrain was a nightmare. High walls, singular choke points. A perfect place to kill an army. "Sir, with respect," Elena pressed, "the A-10s should be on Alert 5, cocked and locked, just in case." "Denied." Holloway turned back to his paperwork. "The treaty explicitly forbids fixed-wing attack aircraft within 50 miles of the border during the summit window. You are grounded, Captain. Go get some chow." Elena stood there for a moment, the hum of the servers filling the silence. She looked at the blue dots one last time. They looked fragile, exposed. She turned and walked out, the heavy door sealing behind her. She didn't go to the mess hall. She walked back out into the heat, toward the flight line. Her eyes locked on the rogue shape of her A-10. Quiet professionals, she thought. The dead are quiet, too. As she reached the tarmac, the ground vibration started. Not a plane. A phone. The secure line in the maintenance shack began to ring. It wasn't the rhythmic ring of a routine call. It was the jagged, uninterrupted buzz of a priority override. Elena stopped. She looked at the empty sky, then at the shack. The wind picked up, blowing sand against her visor, sounding like 1,000 tiny scratching fingers. Something was coming. The priority phone in the maintenance shack didn't just ring. It screamed, a harsh mechanical shriek that cut through the heavy desert wind. Elena watched the crew chief snatch the receiver, his face draining of color within seconds. He didn't say a word, just slammed the handset down and sprinted toward the flight line dispatch, ignoring her completely. Elena didn't wait for an invitation. She turned on her heel and jogged back toward the Tactical Operations Center, TOC, moving against the flow of support staff who were suddenly, inexplicably busy. The earlier lethargy of the base had evaporated, replaced by the sharp, metallic scent of adrenaline. She slipped through the heavy blast doors just as a frantic comms officer was trying to stabilize a link. The main screen, previously a static map, was now dominating the room with a live feed from an MQ-9 Reaper circling at 20,000 feet above the Karak Valley. The image was a grainy wash of grays and whites, thermal imaging that turned the world into a ghost land. "Signal is degrading, Colonel," a tech sergeant reported, his fingers flying across a keyboard. "Atmospherics in the valley are playing hell with the uplink. We're losing resolution." Elena moved to the back of the room, finding a shadow near the coffee urns where she wouldn't be immediately kicked out. She locked her eyes on the screen. There they were. Wolfpack. 400 men were reduced to tiny, pulsing white clusters moving through the black veins of a dried riverbed. They looked painfully small against the towering, washed-out cliffs of the Grinder. Even from this altitude, the terrain looked wrong. The satellite maps had shown a wide pass, but the thermal feed revealed a jagged, claustrophobic throat of rock, choked with debris and boulders the size of houses. "Lead element is passing checkpoint Alpha," the radio crackled. The voice was whispered, heavily distorted by encryption. "Solid copy. Movement is slow. Terrain is non-permissive. Over." Colonel Holloway stood with his arms crossed, staring at the screen. "They're behind schedule," he muttered to his XO. "If they don't clear the ravine in 20 minutes, they lose the dark window." Elena squinted at the screen. Something was nagging at the edge of her perception. The Reaper's camera was focused tight on the SEALs, tracking their formation. It was a perfect, textbook infiltration. Too perfect. "Pan out," Elena whispered, though no one could hear her. "Don't look at the team. Look at the walls." As if hearing her thoughts, the drone operator shifted the view slightly to track a straggler. The camera panned across the ridgeline of the eastern cliff. For a fraction of a second, the screen flickered, a digital artifact caused by the poor connection. But in that glitch, Elena saw it. A row of white dots along the ridge. Cold, stationary. They weren't rocks. Rocks retained heat from the day, glowing a dull gray. These spots were white-hot, then suddenly vanished, masked by thermal blankets or disciplined concealment. "Did you see that?" Elena stepped forward, forgetting her place. "Rewind that feed. 5 seconds." Holloway turned, his face tightening when he saw her. "Captain Vance, I thought I ordered you to—" "Sir, look at the ridge," she pointed, her hand shaking slightly. "Sector 7-9. High ground. There was a thermal bloom." "We scanned the ridges, Captain. They're cold." The intelligence officer dismissed her, though he looked nervous. "It's just shale retaining heat." "Shale doesn't breathe," Elena snapped. She moved closer to the monitors. "They're hugging the terrain. That's a mechanical ambush setup. They're waiting for the main body to enter the choke point." On the screen, the main cluster of SEALs, nearly 300 men, pushed deeper into the ravine. They were walking into a bottle, and someone was about to put the cork in. "Wolfpack, this is Overlord." Holloway grabbed the mic, hesitation creeping into his voice. "Status report on your flanks?" "Overlord, flanks are—" "Wait!" The operator's whisper stopped. The silence in the talk stretched, thin and brittle as a wire pulled to breaking point. Elena held her breath. The green static of the night vision feed on the secondary monitors showed nothing but darkness and rock. Then, the main thermal screen lit up. It didn't start with a sound. It started with light. A single bright streak of pure white erupted from the cold ridgeline, trailing a plume of superheated gas. It slammed into the center of the riverbed, blossoming into a massive, blinding star of an explosion. "RPG!" The scream tore through the speakers, shattering the quiet of the Tosi. Contact front. Contact left and right. We are taking heavy fire. The drone feed zoomed out, and the horror revealed itself. The empty cliffs suddenly came alive. Hundreds of white signatures stood up from the rocks, pouring a rain of automatic fire down into the ravine. The tiny white dots of the SEALs scattered, seeking cover that didn't exist. "Ambush!" the tech sergeant yelled. "I have multiple launch signatures. Mortars! They have mortars dialed in." Elena watched as the kill box closed. The white flashes of explosions were blooming like deadly flowers all over the riverbed. The SEALs weren't fighting. They were being erased. "Get air support up!" Holloway screamed, his composure shattering. "Get the Apaches!" "Apaches are grounded, sir. Dust storm at the staging field!" the XO yelled back. "They can't launch!" Elena looked at the scrolling casualty reports on the side monitor. WIA, Kia, WIA. The lines were moving faster than she could read. She backed away from the chaos, her eyes cold. The red alert lights of the TOC began to flash, bathing the room in the color of blood. Holloway was shouting into a dead radio. The diplomatically protected peace had just become a slaughterhouse. Elena turned and looked at the heavy steel door. She didn't look back at the screen. She knew what she had to do. The book was closed. The only thing left was the cockpit. The atmosphere inside the Tactical Operations Center shifted instantly from shock to a frantic, disorganized noise. But for Elena, the world had gone silent. She wasn't hearing the chaos. She was feeling the vibration of the explosions on the screen, as if they were beating against her own chest. She didn't walk to the command dais. She marched, her boots striking the raised metal floor with a violence that made a lieutenant flinch out of her path. "Launch the alert fighters!" Elena slammed her hand down on the console in front of Colonel Holloway, startling him. "Sir, launch the birds. Now." Holloway looked up, his face pale in the wash of the red emergency lighting that had just triggered. He looked like a man trying to solve a calculus problem while his house burned down. "Captain Vance, stand down. You don't have the authority." "They are dying, Colonel." Elena pointed at the main screen. The thermal feed was a nightmare. The small white clusters of the SEALs were fragmenting, surrounded by the aggressive, surging heat signatures of the enemy force. "That is a battalion-strength ambush. They need close air support, CAS, within 10 minutes, or there won't be anyone left to extract." "We are under a level 1 diplomatic freeze," Holloway shouted back, his voice cracking. He stood up, trying to use his height to intimidate her, but Elena didn't blink. "The treaty forbids fixed-wing assets. If I launch A-10s across that border, the coalition collapses. The State Department has been clear." "The State Department isn't in that ravine!" Elena screamed, her voice raw. "Those are 400 American operators. Are you telling me we are going to let them be slaughtered because of a piece of paper?" "Get me the Joint Chiefs!" Holloway barked at his comms officer, ignoring her. "Get me Washington." "Washington is 6,000 miles away and asleep." Elena grabbed the edge of the desk, leaning in until she was inches from his face. "By the time you get a suit on the phone, Wolfpack will be a memory. I have 2 jets prepped on the ramp. I can be wheels up in 4 minutes. I can be over the target in 20. "No," Holloway said, his voice dropping to a dangerous, icy calm. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a digital keycard. He slotted it into the flight operations terminal. System lock engaged. The text flashed across the dispatch screens in bright amber letters. "I am locking the flight roster, Captain," Holloway said, his eyes hard. "No aircraft leaves this tarmac without my biometric override. If you so much as touch a throttle, I will have you court-martialed for mutiny before you clear the blast fence. Do you understand me? Elena stared at him. It wasn't malice in his eyes. It was fear. He was terrified of the politics, terrified of losing his command, terrified of making the wrong call that would end his career. He was choosing the safe death of 400 men over the risky life of his own reputation. "You're killing them," she whispered. The realization hit her like a physical blow to the gut. "You are signing their death warrants." "I am following orders, Vance. Something you seem incapable of doing." Holloway sat back down, turning his back to her to face the screens. "Security, escort Captain Vance out of the tow sea. She is confined to quarters until further notice." Two MPs stepped out of the shadows, their hands resting tentatively on their holsters. They looked at Elena, then at the screen, their expressions torn. They knew what was happening. Everyone in the room knew. Elena backed away before they could touch her. Her hands were trembling, not from fear, but from a rage so hot it felt like it was burning her skin. She looked at the blue force tracker on the side monitor. The blue icons, representing individual SEAL transponders, were blinking. One by one, they were turning from solid blue to a dull, static gray. Signal lost. Signal lost. Signal lost. The room was filled with the hum of servers and the distant, tinny sound of radio chatter, but the voices were panicked, overlapping screams for help that were being recorded but not answered. Then, the speakers crackled with a clarity that silenced the entire room. The static cleared for one terrifying second. "Overlord! Overlord! This is Wolfpack 7. The voice was young, terrified, and accompanied by the deafening roar of a machine gun firing right next to the microphone. "We are combat ineffective. Casualty collection point is overrun. They are inside the perimeter. For God's sake, drop it on us. Danger close." There was a pause, filled with the sound of men screaming. "Broken Arrow! I say again, Broken Arrow! Sector 4! Any station, help us!" The transmission cut with a sharp, final click. "Broken Arrow," the comms officer whispered, his face ashen. The code for a ground unit facing imminent destruction. The code that authorized any and all available support to save them. Holloway stared at the microphone, his hand hovering over the transmit button. He didn't press it. He didn't move. Elena looked at the colonel's frozen back. Then she looked at the MPs. They weren't looking at her anymore. They were staring at the floor, ashamed. She didn't say another word. She didn't salute. She turned and walked out of the heavy steel doors into the blinding afternoon sun. The silence of the desert hit her again, but now it sounded like a graveyard. She wasn't going to her quarters. Elena didn't storm straight to the flight line. She stopped in the airlock, the transition chamber between the chaotic, red-lit talk and the blinding white desert outside. The heavy steel door clicked shut behind her, muffling the screams of Broken Arrow into a dull, rhythmic thudding against the metal. She needed to be sure. Treason wasn't a decision you made on a pulse spike. It was a decision you made on data. To her left, mounted on the reinforced concrete wall, was the secondary logistics and support status board. It was a glowing LCD panel that tracked every friendly asset in the theater. It was passive, emotionless, and brutally honest. Elena wiped a bead of sweat from her eye and focused on the scrolling text. She forced her breathing to slow, pushing the rage down into a cold, dark place where she kept her targeting solutions. She needed to do the math. Asset, QRF, Quick Reaction Force. Hammer. Status, mobilizing. ETA to Sector 4. Intro 4, Jarton to Lubjo. 4 hours. She looked at the terrain map overlay. The SEALs were pinned in a depression at Grid 44 Bravo. The enemy was moving in from the high ground at Grid 44 Charlie and 44 Delta. The distance between the two forces was shrinking. Current separation. 50 meters. Hugging tactics, Elena whispered to the empty room. The enemy knew exactly who they were fighting. They knew American doctrine relied on massive air superiority, so they were negating it by grabbing the SEALs by the belt buckle. At 50 meters, you couldn't drop a GBU-12 laser-guided bomb. The blast radius was too large. The fragmentation would kill the Americans just as dead as the insurgents. You couldn't call in 155 mm artillery for the same reason. The enemy had created a tactical problem with only one solution: precision, surgical, low-altitude, high-volume kinetic energy. A GBU-12 was a sledgehammer. The A-10's gun was a scalpel. Elena looked back at the timeline. Wolfpack ammo load, 60%. Rate of fire, sustained. Wolfpack casualty rate, 12% and climbing. She ran the numbers in her head, the arithmetic of death that every officer was taught but prayed never to use. Based on the volume of fire she'd heard on the radio, the SEALs would be black on ammo, completely empty, in 45 minutes. 4 hours for the relief column, 45 minutes of bullets. The gap was 3 hours and 15 minutes. That gap was a grave. "There is no other way," she said, the words tasting like ash. She wasn't arguing with Holloway anymore. She wasn't arguing with the treaty. She was arguing with physics. If she didn't put a gun over that ravine, 400 letters of condolence were going out tomorrow morning. The door to the TOC opened behind her. A young corporal stepped out, holding a stack of printouts. He froze when he saw her standing there, staring at the logistics board like it was a holy text. "Captain," he stammered. "Colonel Holloway said you were confined to quarters. The MPs are looking for you." Elena turned slowly. Her face was completely slack, void of the anger that had been there moments ago. Her eyes were terrifyingly clear. "Corporal," she said, her voice steady, "what is the flight time for a standard maintenance loop?" 40 minutes, ma'am. Why?" "No reason." She looked past him, through the thick plexiglass of the outer door, toward the flight line. The heat shimmer off the tarmac distorted the shapes of the aircraft, making them look like mirages. But one shape was distinct: the high, straight wings. The twin engines mounted high on the tail. The ugly, beautiful snout of the warthog. It was sitting in the sun, fully fueled, fully armed, and grounded by a man who was afraid of a phone call. Elena looked at the corporal one last time. "Keep your head down, kid. It's going to get loud." She pushed open the outer door and stepped into the furnace of the afternoon. The heat hit her like a physical weight, but she didn't flinch. She walked with purpose, not running, not hiding. She walked like a pilot who had a flight plan filed and approved. She reached into her flight suit pocket and pulled out her gloves, pulling them on tight. The leather groaned as she clenched her fists. She wasn't Valkyrie anymore. She was a thief, and she was about to steal $40 million of government property to go start a war. The walk to the aircraft was the longest 300 yards of Elena's life. She forced herself to keep a steady pace, resisting the urge to run. Running drew attention. Running implied panic. A pilot walking with a clipboard was just a pilot doing her job. The heat on the tarmac was suffocating, radiating off the concrete in shimmering waves that distorted the horizon. Her A-10, tail number 81, Martin 64, sat silent and heavy, a beast sleeping in the sun. The boarding ladder was down, the canopy open. Senior Airman Miller was still there, wiping down the struts of the landing gear with a rag that looked blacker than the tires. He looked up as she approached, shielding his eyes against the glare. "Captain?" Miller frowned, wiping his hands on his pants. "I thought the bird was grounded. Dispatch just broadcast a blanket hold on all fixed-wing assets. Colonel's orders." Elena stopped at the base of the ladder. She didn't look at him immediately. She looked at the chocks under the wheels. They were the only thing keeping 40 tons of potential violence from rolling forward. "Change of plans, Chief," Elena lied, her voice calm, practiced. She tapped the side of her helmet. "TOC is seeing some anomalous readings on the inertial navigation system, INS link. They want me to spin up the APU and run a full diagnostic on the avionics suite. Keep the engine cold, just power up the systems." Miller hesitated. He was young, but he wasn't stupid. "I didn't get a work order for that, ma'am. Usually maintenance control calls it down." "Comms are jammed with the situation in the valley, Miller," Elena snapped, injecting just enough officer-to-enlisted irritation to make him flinch. "Do you want to be the reason we have a nav failure when the hold is lifted? Pull the remove before flight tags on the sensors. I need clean data." It was a gamble, a massive career-ending gamble. If he called the tower to verify, she was done. The MPs would be here in 60 seconds. Miller stared at her for a heartbeat, then looked at the talk building in the distance. He sighed, nodded, and moved to the nose of the aircraft. "You got it, Captain. Pulling pins." Elena climbed the ladder, her heart hammering against her ribs so hard she thought it would crack them. She dropped into the titanium bathtub of the cockpit and strapped in. The familiar smell of worn leather, dry sweat, and hydraulic fluid flooded her senses. It was the smell of home. It was the smell of war. She didn't look right or left. She flipped the battery switch. The cockpit screens flickered to life, glowing with amber text. "Left engine, off. Right engine, off. APU, start." The high-pitched whine of the auxiliary power unit began to scream behind her, a rising crescendo that drowned out the wind. She saw Miller give her a thumbs up from the ground, signaling the pins were pulled. He expected her to sit there and run tests. Elena looked at the engine gauges. She wasn't running tests. "Forgive me, Miller," she whispered. She reached for the canopy lever and pulled it down. The heavy glass shell sealed her in, muting the world outside. She was isolated now, just her and the machine. She initiated the start sequence for the left engine. The fan blades began to rotate, a low growl building into a roar. On the tarmac, Miller froze. He spun around, his eyes wide. Starting the main engines wasn't part of a diagnostic. He waved his arms frantically, crossing them over his head in the universal cut engines signal. Elena ignored him. She started the right engine. The A-10 shuddered as both turbofans spooled up to idle. The noise was deafening now, a twin-engine scream that shook the air itself. "Thunder 2-1, tower." The radio crackled to life, the controller's voice sharp with confusion. "We show engine start on the ramp. You are not cleared for start. Shut down immediately. I repeat, shut down." Elena didn't answer. She didn't even put her headset on fully yet. She released the parking brake. The jet didn't move. The chocks were still in place. She pushed the throttles forward. The engines roared, fighting the wooden blocks. The nose of the plane dipped, straining against the resistance. "Captain Vance!" Miller was screaming now, running toward the wing, trying to get her attention. He knew what she was doing. He knew she was going to jump the chocks. With a violent lurch, the A-10 surged forward, the tires crushing the wooden blocks into splinters. The jet rolled out of its spot, turning sharply onto the taxiway. Miller stumbled back, the blast from the exhaust knocking his hat off and sending him tumbling into the dust. "Tower to security! Stop that aircraft! Stop that aircraft!" Elena flipped the radio switch to the guard frequency, locking out the tower's desperate pleas. She lined up the nose with the taxiway centerline. She wasn't going to the end of the runway. There wasn't time. She was taking the intersection departure. She checked the master arm switch. Safe. For now. She checked the fuel. Full. She checked her conscience. Clear. She pushed the throttles to the stops. The A-10 didn't accelerate like a sports car. It gathered momentum like a freight train falling off a cliff. The General Electric TF-34 engines screamed at full military power, sucking in the hot desert air and spitting out thousands of pounds of thrust. Elena wasn't on the runway. She was tearing down taxiway Bravo, a strip of concrete half the width of the main strip and riddled with expansion joints that hammered through the landing gear. Thunder 2-1. Abort immediately. You are not cleared. I repeat, abort. The tower controller's voice was cracking, shifting from confusion to genuine panic. Security vehicles are intercepting. Elena glanced at her side mirrors. 2 Humvees were racing from the perimeter road, blue lights flashing, trying to cut off her angle. They were too late. She was already passing 80 knots. The end of the taxiway wasn't open air. It was a blast fence designed to deflect jet exhaust. She had to rotate before she hit it, or she would turn 40 tons of titanium and high explosives into a fireball visible from space. "Come on, you ugly beast!" Elena gritted her teeth, feeling the stick vibrate in her hands. "Fly!" At 120 knots, she pulled back on the stick. The nose wheel lifted, feeling light. The main gear hesitated, then broke contact with the earth. The A-10 lurched into the sky, the blast fence flashing beneath her wheels with inches to spare. She didn't climb. Climbing made you a target. She stayed low, barely clearing the perimeter wire, her shadow racing across the scrub brush at 300 miles per hour. "Thunder 2-1, this is base defense," a new voice cut in. Ideally, this voice would be calm. It wasn't. It was the icy, robotic tone of the fire control officer for the Patriot battery stationed on the North Ridge. "Your transponder is squawking unauthorized. You are designated a renegade. Ident immediately, or we will engage." Elena's heart stopped. A Patriot missile didn't miss. It didn't care about intent or heroism. It did math, and right now, the math said she was a threat. She reached down and flipped the IFF, identification friend or foe switch to standby. She went dark electronically. To the radar, she was now just a piece of metal moving fast. "Defensive maneuver," she whispered. She shoved the stick forward. The horizon rushed up to meet her. She pushed the A-10 down until the radar altimeter read 40 feet. She was flying nap of the earth, tucking the jet into the radar shadow of the terrain. At this altitude, the ground clutter, the returns from hills, rocks, and buildings, confused the targeting radars. "Radar contact lost," the defense officer reported, frustration bleeding into the transmission. "Target has dropped off the scope." Elena exhaled, a ragged sound in her oxygen mask. She banked hard left, putting a ridgeline between her and the base. The G-forces pressed her into the ejection seat, her G-suit inflating around her legs to keep the blood in her brain. She was graying out, her vision tunneling, but she held the turn. She was out. She was free of the base, but she was also free of her protection. The landscape below changed from the ordered geometry of the military installation to the chaotic, jagged browns of the open desert. She was alone. No wingman, no AWACS, no permission. A strange calmness settled over her. The panic of the theft was gone, replaced by a cold, professional clarity. She checked her store's management system: gun, 1,150 rounds, combat mix, missiles, 2X AGM-65 Maverick, rockets, 2X LAU-131 pods, bombs, 2X GBU-12. It was a heavy load for the distance she had to cover. She adjusted her trim, fighting the urge to climb to a fuel-saving altitude. She had to stay low until she crossed the mountain range that marked the border of the denied zone. Vance. The voice wasn't on the radio. It was in her head. It was her father's voice, a retired phantom pilot. There are old pilots, and there are bold pilots, but there are no old, bold pilots. "I'm not trying to get old," she muttered. "I'm trying to get them home." She checked the map. The Carrack Valley was 20 minutes out at this speed. The diplomatic line, latitude 34 north, was 5 minutes away. Once she crossed that imaginary line on the map, she was legally invading a sovereign nation. The radio crackled again. This time, it wasn't the tower or the defense battery. It was the deep, resonant voice of Colonel Holloway, broadcasting on the guard frequency that every aircraft monitored. "Thunder 2-1, this is Overlord. You are crossing into a politically denied zone. Turn back immediately. I repeat, RTB immediately." Elena stared at the horizon. The mountains were getting closer, rising like jagged teeth. She could see the border markers on her tactical display. "Overlord Thunder 2-1. I have broken squelch. I am unable to copy," Elena lied, her voice flat, devoid of the tremors shaking her hands on the stick. "Vance, do not do this." Holloway's voice broke protocol, desperate. "If you drop ordnance across that border, there is no coming back. You will be court-martialed before your wheels touch the tarmac. Do you hear me? That is a direct order." Elena looked at the fuel gauge, then at the targeting pod feed, which was currently blank, but would soon show the slaughter she knew was happening. She reached up to the console above her head. Her gloved finger hovered over the SATCOM switch. "I hear you, Colonel," she whispered to the empty cockpit. "But they can't." She flipped the switch. The satellite link died. The radio went static silent. She pushed the throttles past the detent. The A-10 surged toward the mountains. She was a rogue element now, an angel of death with clipped wings, falling toward the earth. The transition from the open desert to the Carrack Valley was like flying into the mouth of a wolf. The mountains didn't just rise. They leapt up, jagged walls of granite tearing at the sky, casting long, freezing shadows over the valley floor. Elena banked the A-10 hard to the right, slipping between two peaks that felt close enough to scrape the paint off her wingtips. Her radar altimeter fluctuated wildly, 200 feet, 500 feet, 100 feet, as the terrain rose and fell beneath her. "Wolfpack, this is Thunder 2-1, transmitting in the blind. Do you copy?" Static, just a wall of white noise, harsh and rhythmic. She switched frequencies. "Wolfpack Thunder, if you hear me, click your mic twice." Nothing but the hiss of the atmosphere and the low growl of her own engines. The enemy wasn't just hugging the ground, they were hugging the spectrum. They were jamming the UHF and VHF bands, flooding the valley with electronic garbage to prevent the SEALs from coordinating their defense. Elena cursed, slamming her fist against the side of the canopy rail. She was flying a $40 million gunship, but without a voice on the ground, she was useless. She couldn't just spray the valley. The grinder was a confused mess of rock and dust. From the air, a SEAL looked exactly like an insurgent. She checked her tactical display. The digital map was a flat, lifeless grid. No blue force tracking icons. No red threat rings. She was flying visual flight rules in a combat zone, a relic of a war fought 50 years ago. She pushed the nose down, dropping deeper into the ravine. The shadow swallowed the cockpit. The light turned gray and dim. She was below the rim of the canyon now. Thump, thump, thump. It wasn't a sound on the radio. It was a vibration she felt through the airframe, a percussion that punched through the roar of the turbines. She looked out the left side of the canopy. Down in the gloom, amidst the swirling dust and smoke, she saw the flashes, not the chaotic, sparkling muzzle flashes of AK-47s, but the rhythmic, heavy pulsing of a .50 caliber machine gun. Only one side had Ma Deuce. "I see you," she whispered. She banked hard, pulling the A-10 into a tight orbit directly over the source of the heavy fire. She was low, dangerously low, under 1,000 feet. She could see the tracers arching out from a cluster of boulders, desperately holding back a tide of dark shapes moving up the scree slope. She keyed the mic, bypassing the encryption, broadcasting in the clear on the emergency guard frequency. It was risky. The enemy would hear her too, but she had no choice. "Wolfpack! Wolfpack! This is Thunder 2-1! I am overhead! I see your heavy gun! Flash me with IR or I cannot engage! Do you copy?" For 3 seconds, there was only the static. Then, a voice cut through, breathless, ragged, and filled with disbelief. "Thunder, is that an A-10? "Solid copy, Wolfpack. I am armed and hot. I need a target reference point. Give me a mark." "We are overrun, Thunder. We are combat ineffective. Danger close. They are on top of us. Cardinal direction north. Wait!" The voice on the radio choked off, replaced by the sound of shouting. Elena looked down. The flashes from the enemy positions were closing in on the boulders. The circle was shrinking. "Wolfpack, I need a mark now!" Elena screamed into her mask. "Stand by!" The voice came back, desperate. "Marking with IR strobe. Do you see the strobe?" Elena scanned the dark ground through her night vision goggles. A tiny, pulsing rhythm of infrared light began to blink from the center of the friendly position. It was faint, weak, like a dying heartbeat. "Tally strobe! I have the strobe!" Elena confirmed, her thumb hovering over the weapon selector switch. "Thunder, target is... Jesus. Target is 50 meters north of the strobe. Massed infantry in the open. Cleared hot. I repeat, cleared hot. Danger close." 50 meters. At 300 knots, 50 meters was a blink. A tremor in her hand, a gust of wind, and she would kill the men she was trying to save. The dispersion of the GAU-8 cannon was tight, but not that tight. "Copy, Wolfpack. 50 meters north. Keep your heads down." She pulled the stick back, climbing sharply to gain altitude for the dive. She needed energy. She needed an angle. "Wolfpack!" She keyed the mic one last time, her voice turning icy calm. "Look up." She rolled the A-10 inverted, the blood rushing to her head, through the top of the canopy. She saw the valley floor rushing up to meet her. She pulled the nose through the horizon, lining up the pipper on the mass of heat signatures just north of the blinking strobe. The Pac-Man reticle on her HUD settled on the target. The distance counter unwound rapidly. 4,000 feet, 3,000 feet, 2,000 feet. The cockpit audio warning system began to bitch. Pull up, pull up. Elena ignored it. She needed to be closer. She needed to be sure. She squeezed the trigger. The GAU-8 Avenger didn't fire like a gun. It erupted like a geological event. When Elena squeezed the two-stage trigger, the A-10C didn't just vibrate, it convulsed. The 7 barrels of the rotary cannon spun up to 3,900 rounds per minute, spitting out depleted uranium slugs the size of milk bottles. The recoil force was so immense, 9,000 pounds of backward thrust, that the aircraft visibly slowed in the air, shuddering as if it had hit a brick wall. Brrrt! The sound was a primal, tearing noise that reached the ground a full 2 seconds after the bullet's impact. Elena watched the tracers streak down from the nose of her jet, a solid laser beam of orange fire connecting her cockpit to the earth. She didn't blink. She couldn't. She had to walk the fire. The stream of 30mm shells hit the cluster of heat signatures 50 meters north of the SEAL strobe. The effect was immediate and catastrophic. The darkness of the valley floor was illuminated by thousands of tiny, sparkling explosions as the high-explosive incendiary HII rounds impacted rock and flesh. The enemy assault wave didn't retreat. It evaporated. The boulders they were using for cover were pulverized into gravel. The men hiding behind them were turned into red mist and heat haze. Off! 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 Elena grunted against the G-force, releasing the trigger and reefing the stick back into her gut. The A-10 groaned, the wings bending under the strain as she pulled out of the dive at barely 400 feet. The ground rushed past in a blur of gray and black. She was so low she could see the individual muzzle flashes of the SEALs' rifles shifting from the north to the east. She banked hard left, climbing back toward the jagged rim of the canyon, checking her HUD. Wolfpack Thunder, guns off, assess effects. She breathed into the mask, her heart rate spiking to 160 beats per minute. For a second, there was silence. Then, the radio erupted. Good hits! Good hits! Thunder, you wiped them out! That was holy hell! The voice of the Joint Terminal Attack Controller, JTAC, was bordering on hysterical relief. Enemy assault element is neutralized. We have breathing room. Elena didn't smile. She didn't celebrate. She checked her ammo counter. Gun, 950 rounds remaining. She had burned 200 rounds in 3 seconds. The math of survival was expensive. Copy, Wolfpack. Don't get comfortable. That was just the tip of the spear. Elena replied, her voice flat. Reorienting for re-attack. Give me the next priority target. Thunder, we have technicals, mounted trucks, moving up the dry wash to the east. Grid 44 Charlie. They have heavy machine guns suppressing our flank. Copy 44 Charlie. Technicals in the open. I'm rolling in. She pushed the stick over again, reversing her turn. The A-10 was a heavy, ungainly beast at altitude. But down here in the dirt, it was a ballerina of violence. She lined up the second run, the adrenaline clarifying her vision until every rock on the ground stood out in high definition. She saw the trucks, 3 of them bouncing over the river stones, their DSHK machine guns sparking as they hammered the SEAL position. They were dangerously close to the extraction zone. Say hello to the ugly stick, Elena muttered. She aligned the pipper. She didn't even need the laser. This was point-blank range. She squeezed the trigger again. Brrrt! The lead truck vanished in a cloud of fire and shrapnel. The second truck swerved, trying to evade the line of death, but the 30mm stream walked right through it, tearing the engine block in half and flipping the vehicle onto its roof. Scratch 2! Elena yelled, the sheer power of the weapon intoxicating. For a moment she felt invincible. She was the angel of death and nothing could touch her. Then, the cockpit lit up with a sound that turned her blood to ice. Deedle, deedle, deedle! It wasn't the low growl of the gun. It was the high-pitched, frantic scream of the radar warning receiver, RWR. A red strobe light flashed on her azimuth display at the 3 o'clock position. Launch! 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 The automated voice of the aircraft bitching system shouted in her ear. Elena's head snapped to the right. A mile away, halfway up the canyon wall, she saw it. A puff of white smoke. Then a bright, angry star accelerating toward her. It wasn't a simple RPG. It was a man-pads, a shoulder-fired, heat-seeking missile. And it had lock. "Wolfpack, splash!" Elena screamed, abandoning the attack run. "Sam launch, East Ridge!" She slammed the throttle to the firewall and yanked the stick into the corner, throwing the A-10 into a violent brake turn. The missile was fast. Too fast. The euphoria of the gun run vanished instantly, replaced by the terrifying clarity of a pilot realizing she had brought a knife to a gunfight, and the enemy had just pulled out a cannon. She reached for the flare dispense button, her thumb smashing it down. Flare! 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 Reflex took over where conscious thought ended. Elena didn't think about the missile. Her body simply reacted to the screaming audio tone in her helmet. Launch. 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 Her left thumb smashed the countermeasures button on the throttle quadrant, pumping it in a frantic rhythm. Thump, whoosh. Thump, whoosh. Behind the A-10, a chaotic flower of magnesium flares erupted, burning white-hot at 2,000 degrees, hotter than the engine exhaust, a desperate attempt to seduce the heat-seeking eye of the Russian-made SA-18 grouse streaking toward her. But flares weren't enough. The SA-18 was smart. It had logic circuits designed to ignore decoys. Elena slammed the stick to the right and stomped on the rudder pedal, throwing the heavy jet onto its wingtip. She didn't pull up. She pulled in, dragging the nose across the horizon in a violent, shuddering turn designed to exceed the missile's turning radius. "Come on!" she grunted, the air forced from her lungs as the G-meter spiked. 4G, 5G, 6G. The G-suit bladders around her legs inflated instantly, squeezing her calves and thighs with crushing pressure to force blood back into her brain. It wasn't enough. Her vision narrowed. The gray cliffs of the valley began to darken at the edges, a black tunnel closing in on her consciousness. She heard the missile before she felt it. A shriek like tearing canvas, passing just feet below her belly. Boom! The warhead didn't hit her, but it detonated on the flares trailing 50 feet behind the tail. The shockwave hit the A-10 like a sledgehammer. The aircraft yawed violently to the left, the stick bucking in her hands as the turbulence washed over the control surfaces. Elena fought the stall, wrestling the nose down to regain airflow. The stall warning horn joined the chorus of alarms in the cockpit. "Wolfpack! I am defensive! Brake! Brake!" she yelled, her voice strained tight with the physical effort of flying a brick through a hurricane. She leveled the wings at 200 feet, skimming over a jagged spine of rock. She checked her 6 o'clock. A puff of black smoke hung in the air where she had been 3 seconds ago. "Missile defeated," she gasped, swallowing the bile rising in her throat. That was close. But the RWR didn't go silent. It changed tone. "Be-oop! Be-oop!" It wasn't a lock tone. It was a search tone. Multiple radars were painting her. Elena looked up at the canyon walls. The smoke from the first launch had cleared, revealing the truth. The ridges weren't just occupied by infantry. They were studded with anti-aircraft positions. Zu-23-2 cannons, more man-pads teams. A cold realization washed over her, chilling her sweat-soaked skin. The ambush in the riverbed wasn't just to kill the SEALs. It was bait. The enemy commander knew American doctrine. He knew that if he pinned down a unit, the Americans would send air support. He had turned the grinder into a flak trap. He wasn't hunting sheep. He was hunting the wolf. "They were waiting for me," she whispered. "Thunder, this is Wolf Pack." The JTAC's voice came back, urgent but clearer now that she had thinned the jammers with her gun run. "We saw the splash. You have heavy AA on the east and west ridges. They have us in a crossfire, but they're tracking you." "I know," Elena snapped, scanning the cliffs. "I'm a little busy dodging telephone poles up here." "We can't move, Thunder. The technicals are down, but the infantry is regrouping. We have wounded in the open. We need another pass." Elena looked at her fuel. The high-power evasion had guzzled precious pounds. She looked at her flare count. Flares, 30 remaining. She had burned half her defensive stores on one missile. If she went back into the kill box, she would be naked. "If I dive back in there, I'm dead," she said to herself. The logic was undeniable. A second pass on the same axis was suicide. That was day one flight school stuff. But looking down, she saw the IR strobe blinking again. It was faster now, desperate. She imagined the men down there, dust in their wounds, the sound of bullets cracking overhead, waiting for the sound of her engines. "Wolfpack, Thunder." Elena's voice was steady, stripping away the fear. "I cannot do a gun run. The AA is too heavy. I need to shape the battlefield." "Shape it how? We are pinned." Elena looked at the Maverick missiles hanging on her wings. Heavy, laser-guided, designed for tanks. But she wasn't looking for a tank. She was looking at the geography. The enemy was firing from a scree slope, loose rock held back by a fragile formation of sandstone pillars. It was directly above the main enemy concentration. "I'm not going to shoot them," Elena said, flipping her master arm switch back on. "I'm going to bury them." She pulled the A-10 up into a vertical climb, trading speed for altitude, exposing her belly to the guns. It was the only way to get the angle she needed. "Thunder! What are you doing?" the JTAC screamed. "You're silhouetting!" "Trust me." Elena gritted her teeth as the tracers began to float up toward her like lazy orange fireflies. "Watch the west wall." She rolled the jet onto its back at 3,000 feet. The world inverted. She uncaged the Maverick seeker head. Gravity pulled at Elena's straps, the blood rushing to her head as she hung inverted at 3,000 feet. The world was upside down, the dark, jagged teeth of the mountains hanging from a floor of stars. On her cockpit display, the green video feed from the AGM-65 Maverick missile flickered to life. It wasn't looking at a tank. It wasn't looking at a bunker. It was looking at a fracture line in the sandstone cliff face, 50 feet above the enemy machine gun nests. "Rifle," Elena whispered, the brevity code for a Maverick launch. She pressed the weapon release button. The heavy missile tore away from the wing station, its rocket motor igniting with a blinding white flash that illuminated the cockpit. The A-10 shuddered as 500 pounds of ordnance departed. Elena rolled the aircraft upright immediately, grunting as the G-forces shifted, watching the smoke trail corkscrew down into the darkness. The missile slammed into the cliff face. It didn't just explode, it unzipped the mountain. The 125-pound shaped charge warhead punched deep into the sandstone before detonating. The structural integrity of the ridge failed instantly. Thousands of tons of rock, shale, and boulders sheared off the canyon wall, cascading down like a solid waterfall of geology. The enemy position on the scree slope didn't have time to scream. The landslide swallowed the ZU-23 cannons, the manpads teams, and the infantry in a single, thundering roar that shook the valley floor. "Impact," Elena reported, her voice devoid of triumph. "Wolfpack, assess." For a long moment, There was only the sound of the dust settling. A massive, choking cloud of white powder that rose 200 feet into the air, obscuring the entire eastern side of the kill box. Thunder. That was effective. The JTAC's voice crackled, coughing. East Ridge is gone. Enemy fire has ceased on that vector. This is your window, Elena snapped, checking her fuel. Wolfpack led, you need to move. That dust cloud is your smokescreen. It will hold for 10 minutes. Get your team to the secondary extraction point at grid 44 Foxtrot. Now. Negative, Thunder. A new voice cut in. The Ground Force Commander, GFC. It was a heavy, exhausted baritone. We have 32 litter casualties. We cannot move fast enough to clear the open ground before that dust settles. If we leave this cover, we'll be cut to pieces. Elena banked the A-10 into a tight orbit, looking down at the swirling white fog. She understood his logic. Leaving a defensive position with wounded men was a nightmare, but staying here was suicide. The enemy was regrouping. They would bring up mortars next. Wolfpack led, listen to me, Elena said, her tone shifting from pilot to partner. You are in a toilet bowl, and they are about to flush it. The mortars are setting up on the north rim. If you stay there, everyone dies. If you move, you have a chance. We can't carry them all and fight, the commander argued. We need helos to land here. Helos can't land there, Elena cut him off. The dust is too thick for rotors, and the West Ridge still has ADA. I am building you a tunnel. I will cover your left flank. The mountain is covering your right. You have to walk. There was a pause, a terrifying silence where command decisions were weighed in blood. Thunder, we are moving, the commander finally conceded. But if that dust clears and we are in the open, it won't clear, Elena promised, though she had no way of knowing that. Step off. I am your eyes. Below her, the thermal feed showed the desperate shuffle of the unit. The bright white clusters of men began to elongate, dragging the wounded on skeds, moving into the thickest part of the dust cloud. They looked like ghosts navigating a netherworld. Elena felt a strange, maternal protectiveness surge through her. She wasn't just a gunship anymore. She was a shepherd. These were her sheep, moving through the valley of the shadow of death. Wolfpack, you have movers on your 6 o'clock, Elena called out, spotting a squad of insurgents trying to flank the dust cloud. Stand by. She didn't use the gun. The noise would disorient the SEALs. She armed her last Maverick. She targeted a water tower 300 meters behind the enemy squad. It was a calculated miss. Whoosh, boom. The missile struck the tower, sending a spray of shrapnel and water exploding outward. The insurgents dove for cover, pinned down by the sheer violence of the impact. Keep moving, Wolfpack. Don't stop, she urged. We are at the choke point, the JTAC reported, breathing hard. Breaking into open ground in 3 mics. Elena looked at the West Ridge, the one she hadn't collapsed. The enemy gunners there were blind for now, firing randomly into the cloud. But as soon as the SEALs emerged from the dust, they would be visible. She checked her gun ammo. 900 rounds. She checked her fuel, 800 pounds. She was running on fumes and hate. I'm coming down, she whispered. I'm going to walk you out. She pushed the nose over, descending to 500 feet, placing her aircraft between the West Ridge and the crawling column of SEALs. She was making herself the target, daring the enemy to look at her instead of the men on the ground. The shepherd didn't just guide the flock. Sometimes she had to bite the wolf. The dust cloud Elena had created with the Maverick was a masterpiece of chaos. A white wall 300 meters long that blinded the enemy gunners on the East Ridge. But physics was a cruel mistress. Gravity was pulling the dust down, and the wind was thinning it out. "Wolfpack, move! You have 2 minutes of coverage, Max!" Elena screamed into her mask, banking the A-10 hard to the left to keep the western flank suppressed. Below, the SEALs were no longer crawling. They were sprinting or dragging each other across the flat, coverless pan of the valley floor. It was a killing field. 400 men exposed to anyone with a rifle and a line of sight. On the West Ridge, the insurgents who hadn't been buried by the landslide were popping up from their spider holes. They saw the Americans in the open. Elena saw the muzzle flashes sparkle like paparazzi cameras along the cliff edge. "Not today," she snarled. She kicked the rudder, slewing the nose of the warthog toward the sparkles. She didn't bother with a precise targeting solution. This was suppression. She needed to make them hug the dirt. She squeezed the trigger. "Brat!" The gun roared, shaking the airframe. A line of 30mm explosions stitched the crest of the West Ridge, silencing the enemy fire instantly. She pulled out, circled, and lined up again as another group of fighters appeared near a cave entrance. Brrrr! Clunk! The sound was different. It wasn't the roar of the Avenger. It was the hollow, mechanical sound of the feed drum spinning freely. The vibration stopped instantly. Elena squeezed the trigger again. Nothing. "No," she whispered, her eyes darting to the ammo counter. The red digits stared back at her, mocking and final. She was Winchester, completely out of cannon ammunition. "Thunder, this is Wolfpack lead. We are taking fire from the cave complex. Suppress! Suppress!" Elena looked at her wings. Empty Maverick rails. Empty rocket pods. 2 GBU-12 bombs that were useless against scattered infantry. And 2 AIM-9M Sidewinders. Missiles designed to shoot down jets, not kill insurgents. She was a toothless tiger. But the enemy didn't know that yet. "Wolfpack, Thunder is Winchester on the gun," Elena reported, her voice flat, refusing to let panic bleed into the radio. "I am switching to show of force. Keep moving." "You're what?" The GFC's voice cracked. "I'm going to make them blink." Elena pushed the throttles to the stops and shoved the stick forward. She wasn't lining up for a strafing run. She was lining up for a collision. She dove straight at the cave entrance where the tracer fire was originating. She didn't have bullets, but she had noise. The A-10's TF-34 engines produced a unique, high-pitched whine that turned into a deafening roar as they approached. It was the sound of death to anyone who had survived the last hour. The insurgents at the cave mouth looked up. They saw the dark cross shape of the A-10 growing larger every second. They knew what came out of that nose. They didn't wait to see if it fired. They dove for cover, abandoning their machine guns. Elena pulled up at 50 feet, the jet screaming over their heads so low the jet wash kicked up a sandstorm that blinded them. "It's working!" the JTAC yelled. "They're ducking! Keep doing it!" Elena hauled the heavy jet around, ignoring the complaining hydraulic systems. She dove again at a technical trying to flank the south end. The driver saw the warthog pointed at his windshield and swerved violently, driving the truck into a ditch to escape the imaginary bullets. "I am the weapon," Elena gritted her teeth, sweat stinging her eyes. "I am the weapon." She did it again and again. 4 mock runs in 2 minutes. Each time she offered her belly to the enemy fire, banking on their fear being stronger than their discipline. But fear has a shelf life. On the 5th pass, a veteran fighter on the ridge didn't duck. He stood his ground, and PKM machine gun braced on a rock. He watched the A-10 dive. He waited for the brrrr. It never came. Elena saw the muzzle flash directly in her front windscreen. Ping. Ping. 2 rounds sparked off the armored glass of the canopy. "They're on to me," she breathed. The enemy fire on the ridge resumed, hesitant at first, then ferocious. They realized the sky monster had lost its teeth. "Wolfpack, I can't hold them down," Elena shouted. "They know I'm empty." She looked at the AIM-9 on her left wingtip. The heat seeker. It needed a heat source. The technical in the ditch. Its engine was still running, probably burning oil. It was hot. "One last trick," she muttered. She uncaged the Sidewinder seeker head. The audio tone in her headset was a low growl. She pointed the nose at the wrecked truck near the enemy infantry. Growl. Growl. Scree. A high-pitched tone. It saw the heat. "Fox 2!" She fired the air-to-air missile. It leaped off the rail, trailing white smoke. It wasn't a precision strike weapon. It was a desperation move. The missile slammed into the hot engine block of the truck and detonated. The warhead was small, but the fuel tank wasn't. Boom. A fireball erupted near the enemy flankers. It wasn't enough to kill them all, but the sheer absurdity of a missile launch confused them for another precious 30 seconds. "We are at the extract point," the GFC shouted. "Setting up perimeter, but we are exposed, Thunder. We need real fire support." "I have nothing left, Wolfpack," Elena screamed, banking hard to avoid a stream of tracers. "I am dry. I am empty." She looked at her fuel gauge. 400 pounds. She looked at the sky to the south. Empty. "Where are the choppers?" she pleaded with the empty air. "Where are the damn angels?" As if in answer, her RWR lit up again. Not with a missile warning, with a search radar, a big one, from the north, across the border. The superpower next door had woken up, and they were scrambling interceptors. The radar warning from the north was a geopolitical nightmare manifesting as a yellow ring on Elena's display. It was a search radar from a heavy SAM battery across the border, the big neighbor deciding to lock the door. But Elena couldn't worry about the dragon waking up in the distance. The wolves were still biting at her heels. "Thunder, this is Rescue 1 and 2. Inbound your location." "ETA 30 seconds. A new voice cut through the static. It was the lead pilot of the MH-47 Chinooks. "We see heavy tracer fire on the LZ. That zone is hot, Thunder. We cannot commit without suppression." Elena looked down. The SEALs were huddled in a tight perimeter at the extraction point, a flat shelf of rock exposed to the west ridge. The enemy gunners, realizing the A-10 wasn't shooting back, had grown bold. Green tracers were lashing the landing zone like rain. "Rescue lead, you have to land," Elena said, her voice cracking with thirst. "They are out of ammo. If you abort, they die." "I can't set a 30-ton bird down in a crossfire. Thunder, I have 4 crew and no armor. Suppress the ridge or we wave off." Elena looked at her empty gun. She looked at her empty pylons. She had nothing left to throw at the enemy but the airplane itself. "Rescue, I will suppress," Elena lied. "Commence your approach. I am rolling in." "Copy. Rescue is committing. Don't let them touch us." The 2 massive Chinooks roared over the canyon rim, flaring hard to bleed off speed, their rotors kicking up a fresh storm of dust. As soon as they appeared, every gun on the west ridge shifted fire toward the fat, slow targets. Elena pushed the stick over. She didn't dive at the enemy this time. She dove between the enemy and the helicopters. "I am the shield," she whispered. She leveled out at 200 feet, flying a slow, lazy bank directly in the path of the incoming fire. She presented the belly of the A-10, the largest possible target, to the guns on the ridge. The enemy gunners took the bait. Why shoot at a helicopter when the demon that had tormented them for an hour was floating right in front of them? Thwack, thwack, thwack. The sound of bullets hitting the aircraft wasn't like the movies. It was dull, heavy, sickening. It sounded like someone hitting a metal garbage can with a sledgehammer. "Taking fire! Taking fire!" the aircraft voice warning system screamed. Elena didn't evade. She held the line. She watched the Chinooks touch down. The back ramps dropped. The SEALs began to scramble aboard, carrying their wounded. Crunch. A 23mm high explosive round slammed into the right wing root. The explosion shook the entire airframe, nearly ripping the stick out of Elena's hands. A master caution light flashed red. HYD-1, press low. HYD-1, failure. Lost System 1, Elena gritted out, fighting the yaw. Rescue status? Loading! We are loading! 30 seconds! 30 seconds was an eternity. The enemy fire was intensifying. They were walking the tracers up the fuselage toward the cockpit. Elena could hear the rounds chewing through the aluminum skin of the tail, but she sat inside the bathtub, a 1,200-pound titanium tub designed to stop 23mm shells. She was safe, but her bird was dying. Ping, ping, ping. Sparks flew inside the cockpit as shrapnel pierced the canopy frame. A shard of plexiglass sliced Elena's cheek. She didn't blink. She kept the A-10 in the turn, blocking the angle, forcing the enemy to shoot through her to get to the SEALs. "Come on!" she screamed at the helicopters. "Get out of there!" Another heavy hit struck the right engine. The exhaust gas temperature gauge spiked to the limit, then dropped to 0. R-ang, fire. R-ang, fire. "Rescue is heavy! We are lifting!" the Chinook pilot shouted. "Thunder! You are on fire! You are trailing heavy smoke! Get out of there!" Elena looked in her rearview mirror. A thick tongue of oil-black smoke was pouring from the right nacelle. The engine was eating itself. "Go, go, go!" Elena yelled. The two Chinooks lifted off, nosing down to gain speed, disappearing over the southern rim of the valley. They were safe. The wolf pack was going home. Elena was alone. She pushed the throttles forward to climb, but the aircraft banked violently to the right. The dead engine was dragging her down. She stomped on the left rudder, trying to compensate, but the pedal felt mushy. HYD-2, press low. The second hydraulic system was bleeding out. She was losing control. "Overlord? Anyone?" Elena keyed the mic, her voice surprisingly calm. Thunder 2-1 is hit. Critical damage, engine fire, loss of hydraulics. The sky around her was empty. The ground below was angry, and the warning receiver was still singing the song of the search radar from the north. She wasn't an angel anymore. She was a falling star. The cockpit was no longer a workspace. It was a coffin closing in. The master caution light wasn't flashing anymore. It was a solid, unblinking red eye staring into Elena's soul. RENY, fire. The warning was redundant. She could feel the heat radiating through the canopy glass on her right side. A glance in the rearview mirror confirmed the nightmare. The starboard engine wasn't just smoking. It was vomiting a trail of liquid fire. The fuel lines had ruptured, feeding the beast that was eating her aircraft. "Kill it," she whispered, her voice trembling for the first time. She reached for the T-handle on the right side of the dashboard, the fire suppression system. She yanked it back hard. Thunk! The fuel flow to the right engine was severed instantly. A burst of halon gas flooded the nacelle. The roar of the fire died down, replaced by the sickening, asymmetrical groan of the left engine struggling to carry the dead weight of its twin. But the damage was done. HYD2 failure. The pressure gauge for the secondary hydraulic system dropped to 0, joining the primary system in the grave. The stick in her hand went limp, disconnected from the flight surfaces. The A-10 nosed down violently, rolling toward the dead engine. She was falling. "Manual reversion!" Elena screamed, not to the radio, but to her own hands. She flipped the man reversion switch on the side console. The fly-by-wire illusion vanished. The stick re-engaged, but not with hydraulic assist. Now, metal cables and pulleys were directly connecting her hands to the elevators and ailerons. It was like trying to steer a Mack truck with flat tires and no power steering while driving down a mountain. She grabbed the stick with both hands and hauled back with everything she had. Her triceps screamed. The veins in her neck bulged against her flight suit collar. The nose of the jet fought her, heavy and sluggish, wanting to embrace the granite below. "Pull, you stubborn bastard! Pull!" Slowly, agonizingly, the horizon stopped rising. The A-10 leveled out, shuddering in the turbulent air. She wasn't flying anymore. She was wrestling 40,000 pounds of titanium and dead weight. The silence was terrifying. With one engine out and the other at max continuous power, the cockpit was filled with a strange, lopsided vibration. The wind noise was louder now, whistling through the shrapnel holes in the canopy. "Overlord! Thunder 2-1!" Elena gasped, her chest heaving against the harness. "I am in manual reversion, single engine, heading south." The radio crackled. This time, it wasn't Holloway. It was the AWACS controller, finally on station, his voice professional and calm, devoid of the politics that had started this mess. "Thunder 2-1, this is Sentry. We have you on radar. You are squawking emergency. Vector 210 for nearest friendly divert. Distance is 40 miles. 40 miles. Elena looked at her altimeter, 3,500 feet. She looked at her airspeed, 180 knots. She looked at the vertical speed indicator, descending at 500 feet per minute. She did the math. She wasn't going to make 40 miles. She wasn't going to make 20. Sentry, unable. Elena coughed, the smoke from the cockpit vents stinging her throat. "I am bleeding altitude. Airframe is compromised. I cannot maintain level flight." "Copy, Thunder. Search and rescue is spinning up. Eject immediately. I repeat, eject immediately." Elena looked down. She was still over the valley mouth. The enemy technicals were regrouping below, tiny ants scuttling around the wreckage of the trucks she had destroyed. If she punched out here, she would land right in their lap. They wouldn't take her prisoner. They would mount her head on a pike. "Negative, Sentry," Elena said, wiping blood from her cheek where the plexiglass had cut her. "I'm riding it out. I need to clear the ridge line." She pushed the rudder pedal, a pure mechanical linkage now, to correct the yaw. Her left leg began to shake uncontrollably. The physical toll was immense. Every correction required 50 pounds of force. Her arms burned as if they were on fire. She focused on the southern ridge. It was the lip of the bowl. Beyond it lay the open desert, flat, empty, and arguably safer. "Just get over the wall," she grunted, rhythmically hauling back on the stick to milk the lift. The ridge loomed large in the windscreen. She was low, too low. The jagged rocks seemed to reach up for her landing gear. Current stall speed in this configuration was 140 knots. She was at 160. The margin for error was non-existent. If she pulled too hard, the wing would stall, and she would spin into the rock face. If she didn't pull hard enough, she would impact the summit. "Don't stall, don't stall." She eased the stick back, feeling the buffet in the seat of her pants. the aircraft warning her it was about to quit flying. She held it right on the edge of the shutter, trading airspeed for altitude inch by bloody inch. The gray rock filled her vision. She saw a goat standing on a precipice, looking at her. Then, blue sky. She cleared the ridge by less than 50 feet. The ground dropped away beneath her, opening up into the vast, heat-hazed expanse of the borderlands. Cleared, she exhaled, her grip on the stick loosening for a fraction of a second. The aircraft didn't recover. It kept sinking. The single engine was overheating, struggling to keep the heavy, drag-inducing airframe in the sky. "Sentry, thunder has cleared the ridge," she whispered. "But I'm going down. Mark my vector." "Thunder, eject! You are clear of the hostile zone." Elena looked at the ejection handles. She reached down. Then she looked at the terrain ahead. A long, flat stretch of hard-packed dirt used by smugglers. It wasn't a runway, but it was land. If she ejected, the plane would crash uncontrolled, possibly into a village, and she would be a pilot without a plane. "I'm going to put her down," Elena said, her decision made in the quiet place past fear. She reached for the landing gear handle. She pulled it. Nothing happened. No hydraulics. "Right," she muttered, a dark smile touching her lips. "Manual everything." She unlatched the emergency gear extension crank on the side panel. She grabbed the handle and began to turn it. It took 80 turns to lower the gear manually. Her arms were already dead. Her shoulder was screaming, but she turned the crank. Click, click, click. She was a falling star, burning out in the atmosphere, trying to grow wheels before she hit the ground. Click, click, click. The sound of the manual gear crank was small, pathetic, and rhythmic. The ticking of a clock counting down to impact. Elena's shoulder felt like it was packed with broken glass. Every rotation of the handle required a grunt of effort, her muscles trembling from the lactic acid buildup of fighting the unpowered flight controls. 50 turns, 60 turns. She needed 80 to lock the main wheels. Suddenly, the aircraft shuddered. The left engine, her only source of thrust, her lifeline, coughed. A low, surging moan echoed through the titanium tub, followed by a sharp pop. Then, silence. The loudest sound a pilot ever hears is the absence of noise. The roar of the General Electric turbofan, a sound that had defined Elena's existence for the last hour, simply vanished. The vibration in the stick died. The cockpit gauges for the left engine spooled down, the needles dropping like dead birds. "Flame out," she whispered, her voice sounding unnaturally loud in the quiet cockpit. "Starvation." She was out of fuel. The A-10C Thunderbolt II, fully loaded with combat armor and empty pylons, was now a 40,000-pound glider with the aerodynamic properties of a grand piano. Elena let go of the gear handle. She grabbed the stick with both hands again. The nose dropped heavily, hunting for speed. She let it fall. She needed airspeed to live. Altitude was already a lost cause. "Sentry, Thunder 2-1, Elena broadcast, her voice calm, detached. "Both engines out. I am a glider. Position is somewhere south of the border. Thunder, I have no return on your transponder." The ATWACS controller's voice was tight. "Last known vector puts you over the Badlands. Terrain elevation is 2,000 feet. You are at 3,000. You have no margin. Eject." Elena looked at the ejection handle. It was yellow and black, striped like a warning sign. Pulling it meant rocketing away from this dying machine. It meant living. She looked out the canopy. Below her, the terrain was a torture chamber of jagged rocks and dry wadis. If she punched out now, the chute might open, but she'd land in a boulder field. She'd break her legs or her back, and then the militias would find her. Negative on the handle, she said. I'm writing it down. She scanned the ground, her eyes tearing from the sweat dripping into them. The world was rushing up fast. The radar altimeter was dead, so she relied on the Mark I eyeball. 1,000 feet AGL above ground level. There, to her left. A scar on the desert floor. It wasn't a road. It was a flat, hard-packed stretch of dirt, maybe 3,000 feet long, used by drug runners to land Cessnas. It was short. It was rough. It was covered in scrub brush. Runway in sight, she lied. It was barely a goat path. She banked the silent jet toward the strip. The wind noise was a soft hiss over the canopy, a ghostly whisper. Without hydraulics, she had no flaps, no speed brakes. She was coming in clean, which meant she was coming in fast. 160 knots. Usually she would land at 120. An extra 40 knots meant kinetic energy that had to go somewhere. Gear down, she muttered, grabbing the crank again with her left hand while flying with her right. She managed 5 more frantic turns. Thunk. The nose gear lights stayed dark. The main gear lights stayed dark. The wheels were dangling, but they weren't locked. They would collapse the moment she touched down. Belly landing it is. She lined up the nose. The dirt strip rushed toward her, expanding in the windscreen. She saw a rusted pickup truck abandoned near the threshold. She aimed to the right of it. 50 feet. Flare, she commanded herself. She pulled back on the heavy stick. The A-10 responded sluggishly, the nose rising reluctantly. The airspeed bled off. 150, 140. The ground stopped being a map and became a blur of texture. Rocks, bushes, death. She braced her legs against the rudder pedals. She pulled her elbows in tight. She closed her eyes for a fraction of a second and saw her father's face. Fly it all the way to the crash, Elena. She opened her eyes. Crunch. The impact was not a thud. It was a car crash multiplied by 10. The A-10 hit the dirt at 130 knots. The unlocked landing gear sheared off instantly, the metal screaming as it tore away. The titanium belly slammed into the hard-packed earth. The violence was absolute. Elena was thrown forward against her harness straps, the breath driven from her lungs. The aircraft didn't slide. It skipped, bouncing into the air again, shedding parts of the wings, before slamming down a second time. Dust exploded into the cockpit through the floor vents. The noise was deafening, tearing metal, grinding stone, the shrieking of aluminum being treated like paper. The jet slewed sideways. The left wing tip dug into a sand berm. The world spun. The A-10 cartwheeled. The tail section snapped off. The cockpit tub, the titanium bathtub, did exactly what it was designed to do. It stayed intact while the rest of the airplane disintegrated around it. It slid for another 300 feet, a spark-throwing sled of destruction, before slamming into a dry creek bank and coming to a sudden bone-shattering halt. Dust enveloped everything. Then, silence returned, heavier than before. Elena hung in her straps, sideways. The cockpit was dark, buried in dust. She tasted copper, blood. She couldn't feel her left arm. She tried to take a breath, but her ribs felt like a cage that had collapsed inward. Overlord, she wheezed, her voice a wet bubble. Thunder is down. She reached for the canopy jettison lever with her good hand. She pulled. Nothing happened. The frame was twisted. She was trapped. Darkness began to creep into the edges of her vision, soft and inviting. She let her head fall back against the seat. She had delivered the package. The rest didn't matter. Consciousness didn't return all at once. It came in jagged, painful shards. First, there was the sound, the high-pitched whine of a power saw cutting through metal. Then, the smell, acrid jet fuel, hot hydraulic fluid, and the metallic tang of her own blood. "Easy! Watch her neck! Stabilization collar, now!" Elena gasped, her eyes snapping open. The world was a blinding white blur that slowly resolved into the face of a pararescueman, PJ, hovering over her. He was covered in dust, his helmet lamp shining into her dilated pupils. The canopy was gone, sliced away by the rescue team. "Captain, can you hear me? Squeeze my hand." Elena tried. Her left hand was numb, useless. She squeezed with her right. "Good. You're back with us? You've got some broken ribs and a nasty laceration on the scalp. But you're alive. We're going to lift you out. This is going to hurt." It did hurt. It felt like being torn in half. As they lifted her out of the titanium bathtub that had been her cockpit, her sanctuary, and finally her coffin, Elena screamed, a raw, guttural sound that was lost in the roar of the rotors overhead. They laid her on a litter in the dirt. The desert air was cooling, the sun dipping below the horizon, painting the sky in bruises of purple and orange. "Secure the perimeter!" a voice barked. It wasn't a rescuer's voice. It was a jailer's. Elena turned her head, the movement sending spikes of agony down her spine. Through the haze of pain, she saw a Black Hawk helicopter touching down nearby. Not a medevac, a command bird. Colonel Holloway stepped out, flanked by 2 military police officers. His uniform was immaculate, a stark contrast to the oil-soaked, blood-stained flight suit Elena wore. He walked toward the stretcher, his face a mask of suppressed fury and terrified relief. He was relieved she was alive, so he could court-martial her. "Captain Elena Vance," Holloway said, stopping at the foot of the litter. He didn't ask if she was okay. He didn't look at the wreckage of the A-10 smoking in the creek bed. "You are under arrest for violation of Articles 90, 92, and 99 of the Uniform Code of Military Justice, disobeying a direct order, willful destruction of government property, reckless endangerment." He nodded to the MPs. One of them stepped forward, holding a pair of handcuffs. "Sir," the PJ interjected, stepping between the MP and Elena. "She needs immediate medical transport. She has internal injuries." "She can bleed in the brig," Holloway snapped. "She is a flight risk and a rogue element. Restrain her." The MP hesitated, looking at the broken woman on the stretcher, then at the colonel. Slowly, he reached for Elena's good wrist. Elena didn't fight. She didn't have the strength. She looked up at the sky, the first stars appearing. "I traded my wings for iron," she thought. Fair trade. Then a shadow fell over Holloway. "Colonel." The voice was raspy, destroyed by smoke and screaming, but it carried a weight that made Holloway freeze. Elena shifted her gaze. Limping toward them from the direction of the medevac choppers was a giant of a man. His face was wrapped in bandages, his uniform torn to shreds and caked in dried mud and blood. He was supported by a crutch under one arm, but he moved with the unstoppable momentum of a glacier. It was the ground force commander of Task Force Wolfpack. Behind him, a dozen other SEALs stood, silent, watching. They looked like the walking dead, battered, burned, hollowed out, but they were alive. "Commander," Holloway straightened, trying to regain his authority. "This is an Air Force disciplinary matter. Return to your medical eval." The SEAL didn't even look at Holloway. He looked down at Elena. He looked at the blood on her face, the wreckage of the plane behind her, and the handcuffs dangling from the MP's belt. He dropped his crutch. He stood unsteady on his wounded leg, swaying slightly. Slowly, painfully, he reached up to his right shoulder. The sound of Velcro tearing was the loudest thing in the desert. He ripped the unit patch off his sleeve, the blackened, fraying emblem of the wolf pack. He knelt beside the stretcher, ignoring the groan of pain that escaped his lips. He took Elena's right hand, the hand the MP was reaching for, and pressed the patch into her palm, closing her fingers over it. "We don't leave our own behind," he whispered. "And you didn't leave us." He stood up and turned to Holloway. He didn't shout. He didn't threaten. He simply stared at the colonel with eyes that had seen 400 men nearly die an hour ago. "If you put those cuffs on her," the commander said, his voice low and dangerous, "you will have to arrest every single man in my task force, because she was following our call." Holloway looked at the commander. Then he looked at the dozen operators standing behind him, their hands resting near their weapons, their expressions stony. He looked at the PJ, who had crossed his arms. He looked at his own MPs, who had stepped back, lowering the handcuffs. The colonel realized in that moment that he held the rank, but he had lost the command. "Get her on the bird," Holloway muttered, turning away, defeated by the silence. "Medical transport only, for now." The PJs moved in instantly, lifting the stretcher. As they carried her toward the waiting helicopter, Elena clutched the patch in her hand. The rough embroidery dug into her skin, grounding her. She looked back one last time. The A-10 was a smoking ruin in the dirt. Her career was a smoking ruin in Washington. But as the helicopter lifted off, banking over the desert, she saw the SEALs down below. They weren't looking at Holloway. They were looking up at her. And one by one, they raised their hands in a slow, ragged salute. Elena closed her eyes, a single tear cutting a clean line through the dust on her face. She was a criminal, she was a rogue, but she was an angel, and 400 men were going home.